which is another reminder. That weekend, the 23rd and 24th, there is going to be a retreat at the Wolfgang Camp. You can connect with Keith. Didn't volunteer himself, but I'll include him in the list of 3: Keith, Sherry, and Aaron, if you're interested in going. What did I do? I shouldn't have said that. He said he'll just send them to Sherry anyway. But we've had a number of folks on our prayer requests the last couple of weeks, and it was awesome to see. Good to see Dawn back. Hope the hip's feeling better. And Miss Pam was back last week, which is awesome to see. Jane, how's your brother-in-law? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So Bill's the one struggling with cancer, and the one that had hurt his hand is improving, doing well. That's good. And I think Becky Todd is. Who did you tell me? You're connected to Becky through family, I think, right? She worships at a congregation in North Carolina. Okay, and she's going to be having surgery tomorrow for a brain tumor, so that's a big procedure for sure. So please keep Jane and her family, and certainly Becky and her family in our prayers. Any other announcements out there? Oh, wow. In Indiana, right? Okay. Was there a plan for y'all to go over there here pretty soon once you get the call? That's all right. That's exciting. All right. It'll seem like 2 months, right? It'll take forever. That's very exciting. Hopefully it goes well. What else? Anything else out there?
Carl morning. He's watching our services.
That's cool.
That's why.
Yeah. Carl's usually they're not here physically. They're almost always able to join online, which is great to have that ability. Last call. Anything else out there? Anybody else we need to be thinking about or praying for? Awesome. Dave, would you mind leading us in that prayer this morning?
Sure. Father, we thank you together this morning to learn of your word and be edified and be spiritually lifted. We're thankful for so many blessings you bestowed upon us. And we ask you to be with those that have been mentioned, help strengthen and heal and guide them. Restore their house to be your will. And watch over those that may be traveling. Keep them safe and return them safely. As we continue to go through this service, that guide us and lead us.
And obviously forgot to mention, probably good that Cass wasn't in here, but happy Mother's Day to all of you mothers out there. And probably not really just easy to sum it up in one day, but hey, we get one day too, so it's equal. But what'd she say, Molly? Oh, come on. But seriously, thank you to all your mothers and happy Mother's Day to everybody out there. All right, so the majority of the time this morning, we're going to dive into a little bit of a study on Jesus Christ. The man, and then the deity, right? I almost said the man, the myth, the legend, and some people would say that is the case. But hopefully, as we've studied over the last, again, weeks and months and quarters, that we've got evidence to point to. But before we do that, last week we were talking about what it means to be made in the image and the likeness of God, and we spent a lot of time talking about maybe what that doesn't mean, and perhaps what it could mean. And we almost wrapped up, but I wanted to just close us out on a couple of things, and someone help the group remind us, what are the things that we could point to to be confident in, to say that, hey, this is a reason, and this is what I can point to know that we were made in the image of God? What were some of the things that were mentioned? All right. We can think. So there's a couple of different routes that you can take there with that. So we can think. Maybe the idea of being creative, or maybe the ability to communicate, right? What else? What other things were we able to point to say that, yep, I know, like, this is a reason and an evidence of us being made in the image of God? Yeah. I don't think it was said, but I think it was perhaps implied, maybe. But yeah, most definitely, right? A lot of people, when we will talk about Christ today, but a lot of people think Jesus didn't have emotions, but we know on many occasions he did, right? And he showed those emotions in a way that was necessary. Sometimes we show emotions today when it's really not important and not necessary, but Jesus really, he leveraged them in a very effective way, right? What else? What other things can we point to? Dive into that more. What do you mean? Come on, you've been in this class long enough. Yeah, we can make pews. We can make this building, right? We can bring the ability for people not here physically to actually pretty much be here physically, right? Pretty cool how that has been, that ability for us to do that has been implanted in us, right? What else? There's a couple other things that were hit on, and one or two that we didn't talk through that we'll wrap up on. All right, so we have a soul. Build on that a little bit.
I was going to say eternal, but haven't always existed. Will always. Spiritual realm.
Yeah, this physical body is going to go away, right? And all of what we know tangibly is going to go away, but the soul lives on forever, right? I don't know if I think it's a little bit different. Maybe immortal is perhaps the more accurate word there, but I knew where you were going. All right. So here's a couple of the things that we sort of maybe hit on, but we didn't really dive into a little bit. So I'll spend a few minutes talking through it. Some other pieces of evidence perhaps that we can point to and illustrate to say that we were in fact made in God's image. Yeah, go ahead, Rich. Okay, so that's kind of where I was going to go next. So this almost inherent willingness to worship something, right? Just think about that for a second. Now, that may seem a little strange to say because you've got folks that are atheistic who maybe don't believe in God, or are agnostic and aren't sure, but doesn't it feel like there's always this inclination for just human to find something to latch onto? And I don't know if worship is the right word, but that's the word I'll use here. And if you disagree, let's talk through that. But I just think there's that inherent, I don't know if desire is the right word, but wanting, willingness to find something and latch onto. What are your thoughts there? And we do that too, right? I mean, we've talked about it a lot of times. I mean, this idea of idols, right? And anything could be an idol, from a celebrity to money to athletics. All those things, in a sense, are things that we worship or people worship to a degree, right? Whether we do it willingly or kind of subconsciously or not, Yeah. I thought it was an interesting point that the study that I'm sort of using as a little bit of the foundation pointed out that there just seems to be this inclination inherently to worship or have something that you're latched onto. Again, whether intentionally or unintentionally. But where else do you see that? Right? Where else in nature do you see that willingness, that desire, as consistently as you see it in humans, in mankind? And the last thing, and then this is sort of encompassed in, and Molly said earlier, what the ability to think, I think is what you said, right? Did you say that? No, earlier you said ability to think. So, we talked a lot about the ability to determine right from wrong, and this is similar, but I think there's a little bit of a difference here. But the concept of having a conscience seems to be exclusive to man. Why is that? I'm sure there's studies to prove that point wrong, but unless they're trained to feel that way, right? So some people call that conscious instinct, what moral compass, whatever you want to call it, right? Whether you know Christ in the Word or you have never come in contact with that, there is this instinctive feeling that you have to know what is right and what is wrong. Paul even says it in Romans 2:14, right? He says that the ancient Gentiles, remember, that didn't have that written law like the Jews had. They had a law, though, because it was written on their hearts. He could have meant a couple of things. I might suggest he meant this idea of conscience and that ability to really know morally right and wrong. Any additional thoughts on that, on the idea of conscience? I don't know. What are some thoughts? I'm not sitting up here because I know the answers. Yeah, sure. That's a pretty ambiguous, right and wrong, though, is a pretty ambiguous concept, right? Maybe. I don't know.
I'm not denying we have a conscience. I'm just saying I don't know if it's
What do you think?
Makes you happy. That's not true. But a lot of people. That's not true if there is a right or wrong. Nothing of every thought. God says.
Did you want to say something? Looks like you did.
I'm still so instinct. God.
Yeah, again, I'm not saying it is or it isn't. Perhaps I'm using two words interchangeably that shouldn't be used interchangeably in conscience and instinctive, right? But so I think all of those things are directionally accurate. But I think the point that we're going back to is whether it's the little guy on the shoulder, as we illustrated a lot, right? Or somebody taught them, whoever's teaching, somebody taught them. Where did they learn it from? It had to start somewhere. But ultimately, that idea is exclusive to mankind in terms of the ability to think and rationalize, perhaps, in their own mind and determine using whether it's evidence or prior knowledge or teachings, whatever, a choice to take. We talked about free will a lot, right? I mean, you choose your path based on perhaps your conscience or maybe a little bit of instinct too. Maybe it's a combination of all those things. I think all those things are tied together, but again, ultimately, those things are exclusive to mankind. Anyway, just a couple of thoughts. Thanks for the conversation there. We'll wrap that piece up. And hopefully all this does is it spurs us to dive deeper, right? I'm not a deep thinker by any stretch of the imagination. Like, it pains me to think beyond anything surface level. And like I've told you before, I've got to read 3 or 4, whatever it is, I've got to read it 3 or 4 times, perhaps at 3 or 4 different times of the week, so that I can truly comprehend it. So a lot of this to me, as I've been reading, is like, man, that's an interesting thought. I'm not sure about that. Let me rethink that. And then I come to you with, what do you think about that? Not as like concrete evidence, like it is or it isn't, right? But ultimately, I hope that it can spur you to dive deeper into the Word. And we talked about faith and knowledge a couple of weeks back, but help you develop a better concrete knowledge and understanding of what God wants us to know and why He wants us to know it, and then our faith be built upon that. All right, we're going to transition and start talking about Christ. You're like, man, we've kind of been talking about that for a while, but we want to break it up in 2 aspects, because we see Christ as man, as flesh, as human, and we see Christ as God, right? The Son. Matthew 22, in verses 34, you've got, and really this isn't just isolated to that particular passage. Keith, a while back, I think while we were in COVID, did a study on just the Pharisees and the Sadducees and their willingness to want to just take Jesus down at any and all costs, right? And they would just poke and prod him with these, what would seem to be ridiculous questions, trying to get him to slip up on his words, to trip up over his feet, to say something that they can use against him, to say, this guy is not the guy that he says he is. And he never did it, right? So in Matthew 22, starting verse 34, it says, but when the Pharisees heard, so he had just kind of, previously he had we'll call it a run-in with the Sadducees, and then this is the next passage. So when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. What do you think they gathered together to do? What have they always tried to do? They're trying to figure out a way to take this guy down, right? At least that's the way I think about it. Because then they go on and they ask him some questions, right? Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? 41, Jesus asked the question, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" He said that, "How is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, I will put your enemies under your feet'? If David calls him Lord, how is he his son?" How did they respond? They couldn't, right? They couldn't. They had this obstacle to just comprehend, maybe not comprehend the question, but maybe just really understand who this guy was that they were talking to and what his nature was and what his mission was. You hear, well, I do. What do you hear about Jesus today, just outside of the church? What are some things that you hear about Jesus? I know that's a pretty broad question. So I generally hear and see that there's I'll say majority, I don't know the right number, but people believe that this guy, Jesus, lived and he walked the earth, right, as a man. I think there's a pretty fair consensus to say that people believe that he was a real person. Would you agree or disagree with that? And again, the numbers may not exactly support that, but that's sort of what I've observed. What else do you hear about the world and what they believe or think about or know about, quotation marks, Jesus? Whether as a man, as the Christ, what do you hear? I think there's a general consensus among those who, whether they're, again, we're talking excluding the church, right? That there's a belief that he was real and that he was a good guy, a solid guy, right? What else? What else do you hear? This is a safe space. If it's not, okay. Say that again. That he was a healer. Okay. Yep. Right. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Islam, prophet.
Same as who are some other prophets that are well known? Prophet may not be the right word, but Muhammad. That's the one. That's the one. Like so, almost pretty much similar to somebody like Muhammad, for example. Is that what you're saying? What do we know about Christ in its simplest form? I mean, we know two things. Extremely simplistic view here. We know that he had two natures, human, and I know we talked a little bit about defining this word last week, so divine. There's a couple of things that we can point to substantiate some of those thoughts, right? Let's look at somebody turn to Isaiah 9:6, and then if you don't want to turn there, turn to John 1:1. Isaiah 9:6, and then John 1:1. Whoever has Isaiah, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and reading that. And then if somebody else wants to turn to 1 Timothy 2:5, that's the third place we'll go. So Isaiah 9:6, who's ever got that?
For a child will be born to us, a son given to us. Government will rest on his shoulders. His name will be called Wonderful God, Father.
Thank you, Keith. Somebody have, we probably all can quote John 1:1, but does anybody have John 1? And I know we've probably hit this before, but Ms. Kathy, is your word capitalized? Okay. All the time in that verse, correct? There's 3 different, I think, instances of word, and all 3 of them are capitalized, correct? Okay, thank you. There's a number of other verses that we can point to. We see evidence of Christ being divine here. How about 2 Timothy 2:5? I said 2 Timothy, I'm sorry, I meant 1 Timothy. Sorry. 2:5. The man Christ. Cassidy tells me all the time, words matter. I think words matter here, right? I think that was intentional, right? We see again in Romans and in Hebrews, he became man, right? He took on the flesh that we live and breathe in and walk in every day. And in Hebrews we know that, and in Romans also it says that he would be without blemish. That makes him unique. It does make him different. But it also still makes him like us, because why? Why was the fact that he was man and flesh important? Go ahead, Lindsay.
Because he was fit like we were.
Okay. I love the passion that Lindsay speaks with. It's great. Yes, right? He was tempted like we were. So let's talk about some of those examples. What examples do we have to point to illustrate that? Oh, come on. Go ahead.
Famous one is in the wilderness.
So what did he do prior to that? Like what up before Satan came and they interacted, what did Jesus do, or maybe not do, more specifically? He had fasted for how long? Do you think the guy understood the importance of eating and drinking, and perhaps he drank water? There's different opinions there, I don't know. But he was at a point physically that would be hard to not say yes to something like the devil's saying. Would you agree or disagree with that? I think there's a reason he did that. It wasn't to show how, not in a selfish way to show how awesome he is, but to show how awesome he was. That he can't overcome it, right? Even in his perhaps weakest moment in that particular scenario. What other things did Satan tempt Christ with? So he tempted him with turning stones to bread, right? Because he was weak and needed nourishment. What other things did he tempt him with? And what was Jesus' response? We talked about emotions earlier. What other emotions do we see Jesus dealing with, like we deal with? There's one that's my favorite that I'll put in my back pocket, but surely somebody's got to know. But what emotions do we see that Jesus deals with and I'd say struggle with sometimes? Where do you see some examples of him truly being a human and battling these emotions? And raising your hand. Go ahead. Okay, so what was that? What was the situation there? Yeah. And so what did he do?
Hanging on all
Flipping the tables, right? You know, anger gets a bad rap. Anger gets a bad rap, in my opinion, and perhaps understandably so. Have you ever seen that Inside Out movie with the emotions? It's kind of funny. It makes me think about it. But we talked about me not being super deep. I think there's multiple reasons, obviously, and probably one main one, that Jesus came to this earth and lived as a human like we have to battle with every day, right? But I think there's also a reason to show that these emotions that we face and deal with and that we sometimes struggle with, it's okay, because he did. And it's not wrong to be angry. It's not wrong to be sad. It's not wrong to be happy, to be frustrated. I think what we do with those emotions perhaps is maybe where we struggle with, and the difference between us and Christ. That's just my thought on that. I don't know. That's kind of a deep way of think. That's me. That's me being deep. I don't know if that's you being normal, but that's me being deep. Yes, go ahead, Lisa. Yeah. Yeah. That's the human aspect coming out, probably, right? Yeah. And I know we talk a lot about, the example that Christ is, and I think these are the examples that we're talking about. Is you see something that shouldn't be happening, people casting lots in the temple of the Lord. Now, I don't know if you need to go in there necessarily and flip tables like Christ did, but you should be upset about that. Or perhaps maybe when we know maybe our own will isn't necessarily in line with what God's will is, or there's blurred lines there, we're trying to figure it out, but what was he doing in that moment? He was praying, right? Yeah. But I mean, that could be the example, like an example of how we can live like Christ, is when you battle with these emotions, when you struggle with these decisions. I know we say it a lot of times in generalities, but he really lived that. Why else do you think, again, this may be silly that I'm even asking this question, but when you think about why Scripture the whole New Testament, the Gospels, is the account of Christ as a man. Why else is that important, in your opinion? The fact that he left heaven, he was sent, born of a virgin. I haven't checked all the records, but I'm pretty sure that would be the only instance of that happening. He's tempted like we are, battled with the emotions like we do. Why else do you think was it necessary for him to become flesh? Okay, yep. How did he overcome it? Okay, but through what? Okay, so he died, right? So if he wasn't flesh, he couldn't have done that, right? We talked about, who's the guy? Who's Muhammad. There's a lot of other, I forget the names. Craig's laughing at me. There's a lot of these other names out there that get lumped into the same category as Christ. And they're just dudes. Truly just people. Nothing unique about them, really. And Jesus was a human like us. What's the difference? What's the biggest difference from Christ and all these other people that claim to have, a deity, perhaps, a divine nature of connection to God in a way perhaps that we don't, or we're not on the same level? What's the difference? The biggest difference? All those guys died. What's the difference? Okay. What did Jesus do after he died? He rose from the dead. Those dudes didn't, I'm pretty sure. You ever find it interesting? Now, I don't know this for certain. There's a lot of journeys that are made to go see these guys' tomb. Do people go see Jesus' tomb? Maybe. I mean, I can't say that they don't, but it seems that there's more publicity about, going to Muhammad's tomb or so-and-so's tomb. Why not Jesus' tomb? Why don't you think that? Well, because no one's in that tomb either. I'm sure people have gone and seen it, but it's not like a thing we've got to check off our list necessarily. I hate saying it like that, but I think you know what I mean. There's no one in that tomb for good reason. Because he wasn't just a man. Yes, he lived like human. He was flesh. He experienced emotions. He battled emotions. But he was God. He was God. So let's, for the next 7 minutes, maybe talk about that for a little bit. But before we do that, any additional... I know we all know what we just talked about, but I just think it's really important to just take a step back. And Christ was man. Like, he was flesh. He was unique, and there's obviously something very special about him. But he battled the same thing we do.
John 11, when he wept, died. I can that. You don't think of him very too long. I'm not even sure why he was sad. He wasn't sad that Lazarus had died. Not to raise him from the dead.
And he knew he was going to, too, right?
He was sad because everybody else was sad.
Yeah.
He had compassion. But
And maybe that's
the reason he was sad.
maybe that's the another human example, right? Like, how often, I don't want to equate it to yawning, but when you yawn, I yawn, right? Like, it's just this contagious thing. And if you see other people laughing and smiling or maybe crying, and you just feel this state of perhaps laughter, fun, joy, or sadness, maybe that's what I don't know, but maybe that's what it was. I don't know.
Was all these other prophets and everything, they got something better.
Hmm.
They were going for something better. Muhammad, a good caravan merchant. You know what I mean? He was out by the end. Better and I think that kind of. What did everything he did for us? He went back to heaven where he started in the first place.
Yeah, he got put on a cross and
I think that makes it.
yeah, that exactly. Great point. So when we think about, and again, I think Christ being the man, you may get some, but that's likely to be more widely accepted in all walks of your life, not just obviously in the church, but in any encounter. You'll get a lot of pseudo-agreement to that by many folks. But it's when you start talking about him being God that you might get a little bit more pause, hesitancy, reluctance, whatever word you want to use. So as you think about Christ being part of that Godhead, being divine, what examples stand out to you that we can point to, where we can pull Scripture and say, let me show you. It's not just what I think, but let me show you. What passages or accounts stand out to you that we can start with?
Like Colossians chapter 1,
Can you read it for us?
image, visible God, firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, heavens and earth. The fact that he is one God that we can't see. So that we glimpse physically what God.
Yeah. So before we go any further, I just want to pause and remember, like, if we're talking, like these whole last couple of weeks are really meant to equip us so that we can give a defense, we can engage folks maybe who are on the fence or who have no awareness or knowledge or even desire, perhaps in the moment, of wanting to know the truth. And I think we need to be able to leverage Scripture, but like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, getting to that point, because you can use Scripture all you want, but if they don't believe in what we're looking at together and why it's so unique and different and important, maybe we're going to need to go back. Just remember that too. So as you were saying that and you were reading it, it made me think like, okay, well, if we're talking to people that just think of the Bible as another book, we have to go back to the beginning and where we started and talk about how it's not just a book, how it is truly one of a kind and truly inspired, using some of the points that we've talked through the last couple of weeks. So again, when you think about Christ as God, what other scriptures come to mind? What other passages come to mind that we can point to? What's that? It's in James, right? There's probably a couple. James is the one that I think about when I think about demons and trembling because they believe, right? Doesn't it say they also believe and they tremble? If that one doesn't give you like shivers up your spine, I don't know what does.
That wasn't, I was thinking of one that was possible. Where that we.
But how does that illustrate his godness, for lack of a better term? God.
Spirits recognizing authority. He has authority over creation,
Mm.
over spirits, and with them.
Was anybody thinking about miracles at all? Like, is that now the ability to perform those miracles? One could argue that he gave those abilities to some of the apostles, right? So, were they God? But what do you? I know we're a little bit past, but maybe we'll wrap on this and we'll go further next time. Miracles, was that evidence of Christ's divinity? So that was my point, right? Yeah. Okay. No, I get it. That's why I bring it up, because there's a reason he was able to do it, and there's a reason we read about it, right? What other thoughts are out there around miracles and that perhaps providing more evidence? We could probably do a whole quarter's worth of study on miracles alone. But I think Jesus' ability and I hesitate to say strategy, but I'll say strategy, right? When he chose to perform miracles, I don't think was just a happenstance, right? He could have done it all the time, right? He could have called 10,000 angels. He could have, but he didn't. I think, at its core, perhaps those are really effective evidences that we can point to say that he wasn't just a guy. They didn't have the New Testament. They're living it, right? So perhaps that's another reason why miracles were effective during the life of Christ. But
I think it's important that miracles are documented by the story opposing this that didn't want to believe heard to him centuries. Wouldn't call him that if he wasn't doing unexpected. So, according to Scripture.
absolutely, it's a great point. Great point. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that. We've talked Christ as a man, but still look at that as you read and as as we're talking, the death, burial, and resurrection around communion and just in your normal study, like look for those points where you can identify: is Christ? Is he pulling that man lever, that human lever now, or is this the? It's interesting to kind of isolate it like that, or maybe he's got both of them pulled. Maybe he's kind of going back and forth depending upon his audience. And I say that obviously he's not pressing buttons or anything. He's just got that. He's very nimble in terms of who he's communicating with and how he's presenting himself and what he's actually saying to his audience. So look at it through that lens as you do your study throughout the next couple of days and weeks, and we'll dive deeper into how we can know for certain that Christ is in fact God. All right, 5 minutes over. Thanks again.